Hello and welcome back. My name is Ilan Kelman. I'm 50% here at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and 50% at the Institute for Global Health. And it is such a privilege to be introducing Professor Lucy Easthope. Last week, the two of us were at the Cheltenham Science Festival, ably chaired by Julia Wheeler, but the real star was Lucy. And we're so happy to have her here as a star again. We're particularly speaking about her new book, When the Dust Settles, which this is my copy, and it's now newly signed. So thank you. Lucy, please go ahead.
For such a lovely introduction. I have to warn you, I may have peaked last week. And also, I don't do well in the sun. And also, as an emergency planner, you'll understand when I say my emergency fudge has melted in my handbag. So it's all carnage today. But it's an absolute honour and a privilege to be with you today. And isn't it good to be back, even if we are all slightly warm at the moment? But it's very, very good to be back. And I obviously did prepare something for today, which is here, but also have come in this afternoon and listened to some really great debates. I was very moved by the idea of the question posed in the last panel of where are you going to be? I think that's a really powerful thought. Where will you position yourself? And that thought with action and agency. And also, of course, we ended the last panel on a note of hope and inspiration, and that's what I'd already decided to talk to you about. So really pleased that I'd gone with that tack. As Ilan says, I put out a book earlier this year, which was utterly terrifying to put out, called When the Dust Settles. I knew that people were post-pandemic, or during pandemic, really, when they bought it. And I knew a lot about disaster brains and how you feel at this point in a disaster survivance of what is now nearly 3 years. So that's one of the reasons it's in quite big font, because your brain is different, you consume differently. So if you can't face the book as a page, it is on Audible and on, it was Book of the Week, so it's on Radio 4, BBC Sounds, and I've done various podcasts, because at this point in a disaster, we have to consume things differently. We are exhausted, we are fatigued. And as I say in the book, we are all disaster survivors now. We may fight that. That may sit uncomfortably with you, but it is true. One of the things that people have come up to me in the book queue, which is very nice, is said I've stayed up all night to finish it because I want to know it's going to be okay. And they ask me what it is, what's going to be okay. And they're like, well, actually, I've realised, we are kind of in a bit of a pickle. The world's a bit perilous, but actually, generally, it's going to be okay. There's a lot more hope in your book than I thought when I bought it. I thought it was going to depress me, or I bought it because I quite like sort of forensic stuff. But actually, I'm not as afraid as I was before. And I couldn't have dreamed of that response to it. And a particularly important review to me was by the retired Archbishop, Rowan, who talks about some of the questions about where we go next, which of course is what all of today has been about. And in his review of the book, he said, these are rare philosophical questions we have to ask, and it's the disasters that have given me that window. Coming here today gives me hope. There's a lot of young, gorgeous people in this room. That gives me hope. You've got a lot more energy than I have, and you can get out there and do stuff. And you'll see in the book that it's not always easy to be in disaster work in your 20s and 30s. As well as my wonderful double act with Ilan, I did a recent event with a midwife who's worked in Myanmar and Sudan and Bangladesh. And we both, although her world was so different from mine, we both shared stories of being diminished or being ignored or being shouted at or being made unsafe. Disaster work, resilience work, whatever you want to call it, climate work, development work, it's not easy. And actually for women and for marginalised groups, it's even harder. But it's great to see the interest today. Working with Ilan last week really, really gave me hope. This session was exciting. People were interested. We came at it from slightly different angles. Ilan's disasters are so big, and some of mine were so deliberately small. I thought enough work had been done by great people on defining disaster, many of those are in the room now, that I didn't do it. Partly I wussed out. There was no word going to define disaster in my book. But I also deliberately didn't go there so that you can have your own. so that you can use some of the tools and the first endnote in the back, which is the wonderful companion through the chaos, leading in disaster recovery, written by the amazing New Zealand Red Cross. And it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a companion to get you through these times. But our disasters united. We broke down the silos. And one of the overwhelming themes of the event was disasters are about what they do often to people. That's not to marginalise what they also do to environments or to animals or to other things, but basically the human connected. The other thing, talking to Ilan, that I hadn't expected actually, and I think we hadn't had a chance to do this, partly because many academic conferences don't come with the kind of green rooms that you get at book festivals. So we had time together, and I grilled him like a first-year undergrad. Big love to any first-year undergrads. I was like, Ilan, what can I do? I want to get better at being better about the climate. And he had all the answers, which was great. And so I came away from Cheltenham really hopeful. And I've stayed hopeful. And I've got a clearer sense of how I can protect and prepare. Because if you asked me that question that the last panel asked, which was, where are you? From the book, you'll see that I'm normally at the end. And when the disaster has happened, it's worse or it's slightly better than the predictions, but the loss and the damage has happened. I hang out with the cool kids from preparedness and resilience, but I'm for when it happens. So I like the hope, and I think the things that you emphasise, I spent some time in your posters, they're all about things that make a difference. And that's where I've really noticed the climate rhetoric change in the last couple of years has become much more, you see in the prizes that are being awarded nationally and globally, they have a similar position to your posters. They're about agency and actions and things that can be done. We got quite a feisty question about death tolls are bigger than ever. And actually Ilan was challenging that mitigation methods do make a difference to death toll. We both shared in a principle that we can't save everybody, but little things can make a huge difference. We also, I think, both recognise the pandemic as a catalyst, a cruel catalyst, but a catalyst for what we need to do next. One of the things that shocked me in the pandemic was that I actually joined Twitter for the first time. I watched all the documentaries on how it is a hell pit of evil, which it is, but it's also really good fun. And I joined it during the pandemic, having watched all these documentaries about how terrible it was and it would ruin my life, and it has. I'm a very addictive person, but I love it. Please do follow me at Lucy Gobag, but don't set your notifications to tell me when I've tweeted, because I tweet all the time and through the night. So turn your notifications off, follow me sort of with a degree of reservation. And one of the things that shocked me in the pandemic was people accusing me of hopium. Hopium. I was too optimistic that the last 10 people on Earth would get on well. Hopium came at me when I said, I think this is going to be okay. I think we can do this. I think it's not going to be 8 weeks. It's going to be 10 years of madness. But, I think it's going to be okay. And that really shocked me as well about the role of hopium in disaster management. I'm going to come back to that. Really interesting this afternoon about the panel around loss and damage. And if you have got people in the room framing a dissertation, framing a PhD, that's where the future is at. I'm a betting woman. That panel really got me excited. Framing loss and damage is a really interesting one. I've just seen a couple of smiles there, so ideas are forming, which is great. Loss and damage, it really struck me. Because one of the things I was really grateful to my publishers to allow me to do is right at the heart of the book is a chapter about flooding. Because so many of us will flood. My hairdresser said to me this week, we've just flooded for the first time. The river did something it had never done before. It didn't normally come this way, but it has. And I asked her about the damage. And she doesn't know about me or the book. She knows where I'm going on holiday. It's a hairdressing appointment, but we don't talk about work. And she said, do you know much about flooding? And I said, well, I do a bit of research on it. I hear it's awful. And she said, yeah, it changes everything. You're frightened for the rest of your life, aren't you? Because you've seen what the weather can do. So I'm really pleased that they allowed me that flooding chapter, because that's where I've really connected. The book's done well in Australia and New Zealand because people have said, you're English, you're from Liverpool, but your chapter on flooding, that could be Durban or it could be Canterbury. We get that chapter more than any other. I also wanted to write the book with lots of swearing. I'm in a lot of trouble with my mum, but there's a lot of swearing, there's a lot of vernacular. I talk about piss and shit, because disaster is about that. We dress it up. When we run exercises for how we deal with people who've been in a mass flood or a major tornado, we exercise and we train, but we ask the people to wear their clothes and be dignified and not come to us in distress. So we don't train or exercise with distress. We talk about vulnerability as if we can predefine it. But actually, some of the biggest, strongest men I've ever seen have been rendered vulnerable by the disaster that they've just been in. So I deliberately went to the dark places. That loss and damage really struck me because, of course, the book is about bodies, personal effects, wreckage, the loss of safety. And the page that the most often people, I didn't think about how my book would be consumed in the world, but the idea of people taking a photograph of a page and posting it on social media and just saying, this is what this feels like after disaster. And it's the chapter on hiraeth, the Welsh word for the life before and the life after. And what climate change will do is hiraeth. It will take places away to which there is no return. They will become an echo. There will be a heart sickness, but there is no going back. I was really struck by Vanessa's answers to the questions and really struck by the sense that we're wasting time. That's what our great-great-great-grandchildren will judge us for. We won't be here to see it, but that's what the books written in 50, 100 years' time will judge us for, wasting time. I think there will also be a lens a bit like we apply to tobacco, antibiotics, smog, plastics. How could you be so inert? How could you be so paralysed? But they won't understand what it's like to be a disaster planner, particularly a woman disaster planner. If you try and shriek for people to come with you to a point, you just sound like a dolphin. I watched a really interesting point of view on the BBC this week about how some coastal towns are doing what I think Vanessa called transformational adaptation. But what they were trying to do was move the town back by the amount of meters that they think it will erode in the next 100 years. But some people were saying that's defeatist. It should be a wall, not a move. We shouldn't adapt, we should defend. And that really interested me. And I know these are all things that occur every day to you. But I thought about Vanessa's point in the context of we leave things too late, don't we? Or we're too arrogant. Or maybe we're too hopeful. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So in my work, it's about living or dying, but also there's a big theme in the book about what it means to live. We don't just live to not die. And the pandemic has really shone a light on British people's, which is my book is quite a British-centric book, Britain's people's kind of view of the pandemic. Everybody wanted to be saved. Everybody wanted to live, quite understandably. So what does that mean for a national risk register that assigns to coastal flooding and erosion a likely death toll of 10,000? Anybody else want to sell that to them with me? Power outages, a death toll of 1,000 per outage. All our national risks have a death toll accompanied to them. That's in the national, it's publicly available. But what the pandemic has made me realise is we don't want to die. So that was quite a big question for me around what are we mitigating against and who are we saving? Another question that comes up a lot in my work is it's quite lovely, I think, to live by an atoll or a coastal edge. Or in my case, until I moved recently, and I didn't move because of the risk of water, I lived in a house on Low Street, called because it's the lowest point next to the river. But it was a lovely house when it wasn't flooding. And I think that's something that really I brought out from your book, Ilan, is this idea of what's the bit in between the disasters about? What is living about in between? Which I definitely pose questions about in the book. I also tweeted this week about prioritising children in the pandemic. And somebody quite rightly replied, no, we should prioritise all vulnerable people. And I realised that I hadn't been framing it like that. I wasn't framing children as vulnerable. I was framing children as the future. So they got to win. Vulnerability was a separate question. But what were we fighting for? And I had a very strong sense as we went into the pandemic that if we all went, that would be okay as long as we could look after the children and young people. And that was a direct challenge. That's been very challenging throughout. And the idea of sacrificing children and young people in some of this has been a really interesting thought for me. How they see the future. the hope, the opportunity, and again, the failure. What I also, I think, in the book really bringing out, which is a huge theme across the disaster world, is injustice, inequality, unfairness. At the moment, I'm a co-editor of an anthology called When This Is Over, which is about diaries and poetry and play scripts that marginalised and racialised communities here in the UK have written about experiencing the pandemic as an unequal disaster. So my head is really in that space of what does unfairness in disaster response look like? But also, I think one of the questions that we got this week has really provoked a thought in me as well about, is it right to frame this as global? Does that weaken the argument? Does it need to be global? Must it be global? It may well be. That may seem a very naive question. But I think the question of the panel before around national interest is very, very interesting going forward in this. And the other question that came up throughout the afternoon is the idea of the polluter pays. I know that very well. Today is 48 hours after an anniversary of a state failing where 72 people died. And we cannot agree on a way that a polluter or a developer will pay for that. So what does that look like? Sometimes in the past, when I've gone to disaster risk reduction and disaster risk conferences, I've felt very out of place. The British, what we might define as something threatening to a community can be very different in the international community. I said to Ilan, I'd done one event where I was between somebody from Banda Aceh and somebody from Darfur, and my presentation was partly focused on us returning Wi-Fi to a flooded community. But I don't feel embarrassed about that because there is a commonality. Two of my biggest post-disaster experiences in the UK, in flooding in several areas, and more recently in the North Kensington district of London, have shown me that areas that are deprived are areas that are deprived, areas that are made unequal, areas that are denied resource, areas that are seen through a lens of racial prejudice is a worldwide problem. It's not a particular British privilege to think that those areas are somehow doing better. The other thing that really came out for me in the panel before was the idea of the bad guys and the good guys. And I would like to see more dissertations and projects on that, because one of the things that I raise in the book is an inherent problem with seeing the private sector as the bad guy. Also, the issue with insurance is a really interesting one. And I raise all through examples and anecdotes issues of where I see uninsurable risks every day. Most days in a country who heavily relies on insurance, where insurance as a risk preparedness strategy, as a risk mitigation strategy, is the government's main approach to UK risk, all I tend to deal with is uninsurable risks. Most households that I work with are uninsured. With many of the incidents that I see happen, the insurance company says no, so the organisation will pay more. The idea of how we work round this and a no-blame compensation is very, very important, and I was really interested in the panel for that. So I mentioned where I would be at the end, and I was really struck by the phrase, we're still creating risks faster than we're managing risks. I only deal in reasonable worst-case scenario. Good colleagues and good friends will work on prevent strategies to stop terrorism. I only deal with terrorism when it's happened. So Adele's point about ongoing damage, the damage you describe, how would it change if you described it as definite? You would hate to. You wouldn't want to put pen to paper because you would see that as giving up. But there's something I use as a little linguistic trick when I'm working with a chief executive of an airline. I'll never say if you lose a plane. I say when you lose a plane. So how would it be to frame some of these risks as when this island doesn't exist anymore, this is what we would do. When the rest of the village has moved, this is how we will support the people who can move. Is there too much hope in your current disaster response? Which sounds, I appreciate, very stark. But sometimes in disaster management, hope is stultifying. Hope is what meant that people stay sometimes in the attic, in the houses in Katrina, after the Hurricane Katrina, waiting for a rescue that never comes. Are you promising hopium in the climate change discussion. You're also right, which is a really difficult position to be in, because you are right about what climate change looks like. You can be asked to go on the BBC News and they'll put somebody up against you who says you're wrong, but I can tell you now, and I'm right, that you are right. But I can also tell you that it doesn't feel sweet to be right. There's a lot of that in my book. I haven't been wrong yet. But it doesn't feel great to be right. It doesn't feel great to predict the disaster and see it happen. And the other thing is, as I say, you won't be here to see it. So just at the moment, take comfort in the fact that you're right, and then lose the anger and the distress. You've won the argument. But also know that as a disaster planner, you can't drag people to where you are. That's probably one of my most important lessons. You also can't convince constantly. It's a very, very difficult one. So a couple of fast tips for getting through this. Allyship. And I thank Ilan for last week. This is a new world to me, tarting my book out in various book festivals. And I'm grateful for allegiance. And in this pandemic, more grateful than ever. Tell your stories. Qualitative stories work. We saw amazing examples this afternoon. One of the questions Ilan and I got, which I think was spot on, was how do we share information? Every year we publish the National Risk Register, but we publish it with the tiniest amount of detail because our security services say if we put too much detail in the information that we give to the public, they might use it for ill, for bad times. So how do we tell people about the risks without actually telling them about the risks? Be much more compassionate towards dissent and rebellion. There is no one true pure science on this. I got an interesting direct message on my Twitter that said, I can't follow you anymore. You tweet one article from one source and then you tweet later the same day with a different opposing view. Well, that's what, I'm a scholar, I'm a critical reflector. No, it's doing my head in. You either believe something or you don't. No, I'm tweeting lots of different views on something. Work with that. Understand that this is not a pure science. Understand the hypocrisy that some of the agitated, distressed people working with you also see. Air travel, waste, masks as plastic, all of these kind of things. It's a bit like the vegetarian with the leather shoes. It's the easiest arguments to demolish. The bigger challenge, and I trained originally as a lawyer, is to argue against climate change. Because in this room I found my believers, but the much bigger challenge is to be able to argue against it. Only in a moot, don't do it in the public, but just between yourselves. Break it down. Also, you're selling me too big an elephant, guys. I can't deal with it. I need you to think like disaster planners. Sell me 10,000 little disasters. Sell me the little floods. Sell me the heat wave that kills 30,000 people. Don't just give me it as a big nebulous thing. Without listening and collaborating, we cannot see, as the New Zealanders describe it, the recovery elephant, the many truths and perspectives that make up disaster recovery. This is critical to successful leadership and good planning. And when I was being dropped off here, I tweeted earlier on, my taxi driver said to me, you know, the problem with you academics is that you publish books that nobody reads. And I didn't tell him that it's a Sunday Times bestseller, but I did tweet it as soon as I got in here. But and I'll make sure he sees the movie. But the other bit of advice he said, I'll give you one. I said, what are you talking about today, love? And I said, disasters. And he said, oh, I wish you lot would just crack on with it. And I think I'm going to take that to mean, let's crack on with it. So that will be my final note. Let's crack on with it. So please do follow me at Lucy Go Bag. Buy the book When the Dust Settles and look out for the anthology of poems and writing and scripts that's incredibly moving called When This Is Over. Get out there and crack on, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Such wonderful words of inspiration and of action. And your book is subtitled Stories of Love, Loss, and Hope. You have spoken extensively about loss and hope, but that third word, it's kind of icky and a bit emotional. You didn't say much about it.
Yeah, thank you, Ilan. I mean, I think one of the things about, I presume some people in the room really, really want to go and work in disaster response. And I think it's come as a shock to people that in some ways a lot of my work is quite UK based. I'd like to give that hope to anybody out there who's quite arthritic, likes decent travel, is a bit scared of a refugee camp and likes 3 regular meals at least a day. Because a lot of my work was in disaster response but not out there. I was often, for example, on the phone. You know, that's how a lot of our work is done. And so one of the things about working in disaster response is you learn to live differently. You love differently. You laugh differently, you savour things differently. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I don't take anything, I don't take a single day lightly. And one of the things about that is, which is very non-academic to say, is that you feel very differently, I think. When you have seen death, and a lot of the book is about death, you never ever leave on a row. And you never ever don't tell far too many people that you love them. But also within that book was a self-care strategy, which is that my home life was also very complex. But ultimately, as somebody introduced me the other day, they said, this really is a love story. And that's really important if you're going out into this work. You're going to get angry, you're going to get distressed, you're going to see some things that really worry you. Maybe even now, you can't believe that people aren't getting there quicker on whatever you're researching. And the biggest piece of advice I would have for you is build your tribe. And I talk about my love for my colleagues, and ultimately, very gooey, so thank you for that, Ilan, but the love of my family.
We have time for 2 questions. So one here. And do you have a second? And it takes about 10 seconds before it kicks in. So wait till it's green. Wait, there we go.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Freya Gary.
Lovely, Freya, hello.
Fantastic talk, thank you very much. As scientists, we often want to tell the facts and figures. We hear that people want to hear the facts and figures, that's great. But we also hear, that people want the emotion and also the story as well. And it sometimes feels very hard to deliver both.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me like you've maybe managed to do both of those things. And so what tips and tricks can you give us for getting that balance right between the facts and figures and emotion? Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a lovely question. I definitely think the emotion connected. I think we timed when the book came out very well, because I think people needed that. They couldn't perhaps cope with a very heavy kind of bombardment. It's also one of the things we were very ready to do, or I was very ready to do, was there was the stories and then there were other places to go for information. One of our biggest challenges, I think, in the Western world at the moment is to reinstate the idea of expertise. And so the idea, one of the things that I think people have kind of grasped onto is the idea of the person who's doing the job has developed an expertise, my qualifications are in the book, but also is very human and sort of, as I say, definitely wouldn't be cast in a Bond movie as the person that goes in after disaster. I don't know whether it'll constantly work as a trope, whether you'll just see hundreds of books by scientists going, and then this happened, and I showed the world this. I don't know whether that would be the way forward. But I definitely think there's an engagement. One of the things that the book is also about, which I think it speaks to your point, is how difficult it is to convey scientific advice up. It's all very well to do 4 or 5 radio interviews that people think, oh, she's good fun, I like her stories. You get a much bigger stronger sense of my pain when trying to advise in taking the stories the other way. So I think it's very, 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 very good question, and I'm still wrestling with it. I have got a podcast that I did called, it's Jake Humphrey's podcast, the BT sports presenter, called High Performance Podcast. The episode is with Lucy Easthope, obviously, and it was about the skills of communicating that I've tried to develop, and I'm very honest about how often I've got it wrong, so that may be of interest as well. Thank you.
One more question. So what advice do you have for students who want to make a constructive difference?
Start small. One of the things, Anna and I, the midwife that I was talking about, we both agreed that sometimes wanting to make a difference can be quite a huge bar to set yourself. and sometimes it's a huge challenge, and you end up perhaps even doing harm to yourself, because it's very gifting and giving of yourself. I would start small. I would decide very early on what your niche was. So I talk in the first chapter of the book about being a child activist in disaster. I wanted to work in disaster. And all through my life, people said, you didn't make that decision early on. And yes, of course I did. So work on what your niche is and define that, what your interest is. It's harder now than it ever was, but what are you willing to do, and where do you want to go? I said, I set my boundaries partly through my own health and abilities. I knew that I probably wasn't going to be able to run very fast. These were the sorts of things you make decisions about. Where do my strengths and skills lie? So I think one of the things, it always scares me when somebody says, I want to work in disaster, because that isn't a thing. What do you want to work with, and how, and who? And do you want to work with people or not? Do you cope well with crisis and startle factor? So I've been very lucky at various points to have very good psychological support, and also things like Myers-Briggs coaching and other things to draw out who you are before you decide what you're going to offer the world. So I'd really spend, if you are at university right now, I'd really spend that time working you out before, because actually not all help is good help. So we really want you to be very certain on what you're offering before you offer it. It's probably quite a controversial point there. But
No, absolutely wonderful advice. So much appreciate you coming here for the keynote and for giving your advice, but energy, but also the love, the loss to overcome, and especially the hope. So When the Dust Settles by Professor Lucy Easthope. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you.